So my name is Katie Coleman. I was diagnosed with a metastatic oncocytoma, so a rare stage 4 kidney cancer in December of 2020. And I've evaluated a number of clinical trials to participate in, even though I haven't participated in any systemic treatment trials. I did participate in a device trial at the NCI and NIH. And I'm really excited about this conversation because I feel like trials is such an important topic for patients to evaluate at all levels of their care. So that's who I am. I'll kick it off. Meghan, you want to go next?
Sure. My name is Meghan Griffith. My husband, Chase Griffith, has stage 4 chromophobe. He was originally diagnosed at the beginning of 2019 and recurred in 2021. He has participated in 2 clinical trials, one in UT Southwestern and one in Los Angeles. So that's who I am. I'm also Vice President of KC Cure. Laura?
Thanks, Meghan. I'm Laura Esteller. I am an almost 8-year survivor now of stage 4 metastatic papillary renal cell carcinoma related to a previously undiagnosed condition called HLRCC, or hereditary leiomyomatosis and renal cell cancer. I joined a clinical trial that was a phase 2 clinical trial in 2016, and that's actually why I'm now NED. I've been NED since August of 2017. So very grateful to have had the response I've had. And obviously, because of my experience, I'm a big advocate of clinical trials when they're appropriate for patients to consider. And I'm also the podcast host of Renal Talk on Renal Cancer, sponsored by Judy Nicholson Kidney Cancer Foundation. So if you all have any feedback for future episodes, I'd love to hear it. But I will go ahead and pass it over to Sal.
Okay, I'm Sal Versendaal. I was diagnosed in January of 2020 with stage 4 clear cell renal cell carcinoma. I did the immunotherapy. I had to stop that because of pneumonitis in my lungs. We waited, gave me a break about 3 months, came back, and I had new lesions in several areas. My doctor told me about this brand new trial. It had just started, and I went on it. It's belzutifan plus lenvatinib against Cabometyx, and I got on the arm of lenvatinib and belzutifan. Back then it was belzutifan. It was MK6482. So I'm still used to calling it that name. But anyway, I've been on this trial now for 3 years, and I've been at NED about 1.5 years.
So I think that we might still be waiting for Gary to join, but maybe we can just amongst this panelists kind of talk a bit about, for those of us that join a clinical trial, what led to that decision. Sally, I'd be curious because you were in a clinical trial more recently than me. You know, kind of what were your concerns in joining a trial?
Well, obviously, you know, it's you're a guinea pig feeling, and but this was stage 3 clinical trial, so they knew a little bit about some of the sorry.
Yep. I think we lost her. I think you're muted, Sally.
There. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I don't know how much you heard, but it was definitely frightening in the beginning. It was a stage 3 clinical trial, so they knew a little bit about the side effects going into it, but other than that, you know, very little information. I was definitely very scared, but my oncologist was very encouraging. He said, if you were my wife, I'd do it, and said, okay, sign me up. So and I'm so glad I did. 3 years now, been NED for the last year and a half. But definitely a lot of nerves going into it in the beginning.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to the nerves part of it. I participated in a device trial, which was a little bit different because I had surgery done at the National Cancer Institute and the NCI in Bethesda, Maryland, where in order to be a patient there, you have to be enrolled in a protocol. And so my surgery was a lot in that realm of there's uncertainty, right? Like you're kind of in uncharted waters, and I think that can come with its own kind of nerves. But I've found a lot of comfort in exactly what you mentioned there of like I had confidence in my doctors, and that like we were moving ahead with kind of what we thought was the best possible option. So my surgery wasn't a trial in itself, although I was enrolled into a protocol that for my tumor tissue, that's like one way you can participate in some of these things when it's more of a protocol and not necessarily a treatment. So that was I was enrolled in for my surgery, and then my device trial that I was a part of was after we did a very large surgery for me to remove my right kidney and did wedge resections of my liver. There were a few spots left behind in my liver, and we were going to ablate those tumors in my liver. And so the device trial that I participated in for that one was a tracking overlaying CT and MRI to try to better target those lesions in your liver. So again, it's in that area of, other people haven't really tried this before, but having faith that it'll, that in your plan and kind of all the risks that you're undertaking for that. For me, it worked out really well for my device trial, and my ablations got me to no active cancer. So it's not always the case with every trial, but I think exactly what you communicated of like having those conversations with your physician and making sure that you understand kind of what you're enrolling into, but also their confidence and kind of can lean on them for answers is really important that relationship exists back and forth.
And I might, if you don't care, I'll just go ahead and jump in there kind of along the same line. So my husband has been in 2 phase 1 trials. The first one was his first line of treatment, which was Ipi, Nivo, and Cabo, which it did not work. And I think that's okay. I think what everyone has to remember about trials is that there's kind of 2 really key important pieces of it. And one is that obviously you're, from a scientific research perspective, they're incredibly, incredibly important to test efficacy of new treatments and test those treatments against the current standard of care. But also you are able sometimes, if it's a new drug like belzutifan for Sally, you have access a lot of times to those drugs far before they are FDA approved. And so I think those are 2 kind of key important pieces. And, we started, one of the kind of things you need to discuss with your doctors when you're considering clinical trials is what the inclusion criteria is. And so for my husband on the first one, he had one very small liver lesion at the time. And we had discussions about radiation at the time, and we made the decision to not do radiation because you have to have measurable disease. So if you do radiation first, then they can't measure your disease. So it's there's a lot of timing and sequencing factors that have to be considered. We chose to actually wait several months for this trial to open at UT Southwestern. And while it wasn't successful, I think we don't have any regrets about doing it, because I think if we hadn't done it, we would have always wondered if he would have had a response to that combination. And so while they don't always work, I think it's such an important piece of scientific research, but also for your own personal journey as well. And So while that one didn't work, I think, we are still to this day very glad that we did it. This second trial that we did actually last fall was another trial. My husband's cancer is very rare. It's a very rare subtype. And so we were funding research through KC Cure. And I know there's lots of other organizations doing the same now for chromophobe, which is amazing. And we chose a solid tumor trial out of Los Angeles based on research that was done on chromophobe at Sloan Kettering. So, there's lots of different things to consider. Sometimes they're kidney cancer specific trials. Sometimes they are solid tumor trials where you're looking for a specific agent and you can go that route. So, but the best thing is you have to do a lot of research on your own and with your medical team as well. I think it's always worth doing the research and going to your medical team, and they may tell you, that's crazy, don't do that. Or they may say, like in our case for the second one, we actually weren't considering pursuing it at the time. And we had two of our doctors basically said, if I were you, I would go ahead and pursue it. So, it's an interesting journey. There's a lot that goes into it, both personally with your own research and with your medical team.
I really appreciate that you pointed out that you guys don't regret the trial that didn't have the response that you were expecting, because I think that's really important. And especially that what if, again, mine wasn't necessarily a trial for my surgery, but I had that exact conversation with one of my oncologists, where I was asking them, this one, a local oncologist, and so they actually weren't specifically a GU specialist, but they had more patients that had had liver resections and different things before. And because I was in this area that I think a lot of people are in when they're evaluating clinical trials where there isn't data yet, I wasn't sure if I was willing to go through with it or not, or I wanted it than anything, but the risk was high. And so I asked him and basically said, what would you do in this scenario, or what kind of what feedback or advice did he have? And the one thing that he mentioned to me was that, again, there's no data to go to, but if you don't do this, you always wonder what would have happened, which I think
and I think that's hugely important. And that kind of goes back to the sequencing too. Some of these trials, depending on the class of drugs, if you've already received treatment with that same class of drugs, you may be eliminated from that trial automatically. So if they're doing I can't think of, a lot of immunotherapy trials, but also even TKI trials, most trials, if they're in a certain specific class of drugs, if you've had one or two, or sometimes any, they're gonna, preclude you from participating in those trials because they really want someone who hasn't had previous treatments with those same classes of drugs, to kind of see what the efficacy is of those. So it is really important not only to not have regret, but also when you're thinking about them, and sequencing your treatment plan, is there a trial opportunity in the beginning that you might not have available to you if you choose a certain standard of care? I'm by no means suggesting that you shouldn't go with standard of care, but I'm just saying that it's just kind of all the questions that you have to ask yourself and your medical team about pursuing trials and when it's the right time to pursue a trial.
Yeah, I think yeah, go ahead, Laura. I was going to mention that I think that's really relevant in rare cancers, which I think you can speak to, the papillary trials as well too, and your experience.
Yeah, no, the first, I was going to say that the trial that I was on, which is called PapMet, was the first randomized trial for metastatic papillary kidney cancer, to be clear, right? So it's funny because now I've gratefully lived so long that now the way that trial was initially classed isn't even how we classify papillary renal cell anymore. So I'm really grateful to be here to see that happen. But at the time, we didn't have a standard of care, Meghan, to your point, for papillary metastatic patients, right? So that was why this trial was really important, was because it was comparing sunitinib to Cabometyx and a few of the other drugs. So one thing that and that was really why I decided to do the trial, was because there wasn't a standard of care. My doctors had some educated guesses as to how I would do in some available treatments, but my oncologist and I felt like this was my best option. And for me, I felt like that I really didn't have anything to lose at that point. And I'm really glad that I did a clinical trial for my first line of treatment, because Meghan, to your point, your options become sometimes more limited as you have more lines of treatment, which I think sometimes can be construed negatively. But, I participate in panels assist with developing clinical trials now. And I understand the rationale why, right? You have to make sure that the patients that are enrolled in the trial, one, safety is paramount. So we're not, we're trying to make sure that we're not exposing patients to treatments that we know probably won't work for them because they've already failed other lines of treatment. But two, so that the data that we get from these trials is as accurate as possible. Because if we don't have that information, if it's skewed because someone's been on 4 lines of treatment before that are similar, and that impacts the outcome, it can, create results that are not necessarily beneficial to the rest of the community. But one of the things that I appreciated about the trial that I joined and the conversations I had with my oncologist beforehand was that he reassured me that if it wasn't working, he wasn't going to keep me on the trial just for the sake of research, right? And I think that's another thing I hear sometimes. Patients get concerned that if I enroll in this trial, it's not working, and they're going to keep me on that. And I've yet to meet an oncologist that would agree to that.
I think I think that's a really, really important part and piece of information. When you sign the documents and there are lots of them, when you sign the documents, it is very clear that you are free. You are not beholden to that trial. You are free to leave that trial at any time for any reason. And I think that's a really, really important piece of information, because, clinical trials are great. They don't always work for everyone. And I think also there's a lot of other things to consider in addition to just the medical side of clinical trials. There's logistics and other things to consider as well, depending on where you live and where the trial is. And those are kind of more personal logistic items that you have to consider. But to Laura's point, yeah, you do not have to stay in a trial for any amount of time that you don't want to be. So, and whether you choose to leave because there's progression, or whether you choose to leave for some other reason, maybe the side effects are too bad or something like that. Yeah, I think that's a really key point here, is that clinical trials are really, really important, but you should never stay on a trial that's detrimental to you. That, for whatever reason, if you're having side effect issues or you're progressing or whatever else, those are all things that you really need to stay on top of if you join a clinical trial.
And I'd like to point out that when I started the trial, I was on the full dosage, and I ended up in the hospital, hypoxia, low oxygen. So they lowered my dose, and I was also having some nausea issues with the Levatin, and they lowered the dose on that. So I've had 2 dose reductions in the clinical trial, and I'm sure it's the case for all trials that there is room to reduce your dose.
Yeah, there usually is.
Which is fantastic.
I went down base, I started on 60 milligrams of Cabo, which any of you that have been on Cabo know is a lot. That only lasted for 4 months. And then I was bumped down to 40, and I stayed on 40 pretty much the entirety of the time I was on the trial until the last about 3 months when I went down to 20 milligrams. So yeah, there's usually dose de-escalations that are built into these trials, which is great, because that was a concern of me too, Sally, right? I was like, oh, I have to stay on 60 or else I'm going to get kicked off the trial. And that wasn't the case, thankfully.
Right. I'm on the lowest dose now, for both of the drugs on the trial. I can't go any lower, but it's okay because, I'm good. I still have some side effects, but, they're tolerable. But yeah, there's a limit on how far low you can go. But, it's working for me, so.
I think there's a comment in the chat that I think is interesting and a good point. Glenn made a comment. I'll just read it. I just like to point out a distinction about leaving a trial. You can stop treatment, but still be a study participant, which allows your information to be part of the trial's data set, which is very helpful. I think that's a really important piece because I know a lot of patients when they join trials, right, they feel the sense that they are helping the community, right, the cancer community, which is such a great thing to do. But I think to his point, you may stop the trial treatment, but they will continue to follow you, which will provide, a great amount of data for them from a scientific perspective too. So I think that's a great point in the chat.
How about interject? This is Gary Claytor. And to give you a little background, I was diagnosed in January of 2020. I started out on the immunotherapy with Keytruda and Lida, and I was on there for right at 2 years when there was some progression, and so they took me off of that, and I started on Cabo 40 milligrams. And I was on the Cabo for a couple of months, and then I was in ED over the summertime of 2023. In September of 2023, my there was growth, so I was put back on the Cabo, and at that point in time, I sought some new treatment, and I went to UTSW and began working with Dr. Hans Summers at UTSW. I was placed on a clinical trial that started on February the 29th, and the drug was called CLS 484. And it was sponsored by AbbVie. And so, as it has to do with this discussion, I went after scans yesterday, Wednesday yesterday, and it was discovered that there was growth in my tumors, which are in my lungs. So Dr. Hammers and the research team did not hesitate to tell me they wanted me to do clinical trial, and so that has been done, and I'm back on Cabo. So they were very, very, very studious with me during the process, looking at me, looking at my vitals, looking at my blood work constantly. Then when the growth showed progression, it was clear to them that it was not going to work, and he said there would be significant risk for me to stay on the trial. So they took me off of it almost immediately, and now they're looking for a potential another clinical trial that might fit me better than the AbbVie clinical trial.
Yeah, and I think we touched a little bit on sequencing of trials earlier. I think that kind of highlights that same point of you can be on a treatment, go on to a trial, and then those standard of care treatment options are still available to you, which you can be on while you might look for another trial. So there's lots of different options for trials available. We've talked about like how it can be important to sequence trials and how you can get involved in them earlier, but I don't think we've touched on kind of how to find trials, which I know when I was initially diagnosed, I found extremely difficult. I know especially when I was first diagnosed, I thought the only trials available were whatever ones my doctor knew about or were at my institution, which is definitely not the case. And there's so many trials happening these days that it can be really, really difficult to stay on top of all of them. So I think there's some great resources to find them. But the one takeaway that I probably take from that the most is that you can look for trials in different areas and investigate some of those. I think there's more research sources that make it easier to understand them as patients. Clinical trial.gov was really hard to parsed through when I was first diagnosed, for example, and it's getting a little bit better. But if you find a trial you're interested in, you can present that to your physician and ask for feedback and context. Sometimes they might be aware of the trial, sometimes they may not be, but they can be able to help provide that lens on if it might be a good thing for you to evaluate, but allows you to participate in that process in looking at trials and seeing what you might find benefit from.
Yeah, and I might chime in. Sorry, Laura, do you want to go ahead?
No, go ahead, Megan. I'll go after you.
I was just going to chime in a little bit on that. So the first clinical trial that my husband did, we also are patients of Dr. Halmer's, and it was one that he really wanted us to do, and we agreed with him, and so we waited for it. So that was kind of facilitated by him, and it was at UT Southwestern, which we live in Dallas, so very convenient and very easy for us to do. The second trial that we participated in, when the new research came out about the treatment that might show some promise for chromophobe, it's an immunotherapy called interleukin-15. And, you know, there weren't chromophobe specific interleukin-15 trials. There's never been a chromophobe specific trial. So we basically had a discussion with Hans about, you know, could this be something down the line? You know, if there is a chromophobe trial, eventually we'd love to participate. And he kind of encouraged us to see if there was an IL-15 trial available now. And so basically kind of to walk you through what that's like. Now, we had a discussion and he thought from a clinical standpoint, it'd be a great next step in our treatment plan. But there was no IL-15 trial at UT Southwestern. And so basically what I did was I got on the clinicaltrials.gov website and I basically researched every IL-15 solid tumor trial in the United States. I sent emails to every institution that had one running. And from there, we kind of had meetings with all of them, parsed through which trials he was eligible for, which ones he wasn't eligible for, and chose the trial that we ended up doing in Los Angeles with Immunity Bio. So there, you know, while it's always amazing when your provider, you know, has a trial ready to go at the institution that's your home institution, that is a great option, obviously, you know, to discuss with them. But sometimes, especially if you have rare subtypes, you may find yourself in a position where you have to do a little bit more legwork on your own. Obviously, with the, you know, obviously he knew that, and it was his recommendation that we try to find one now. Just, you know, if anyone ever has questions about how to pursue a clinical trial that's not with your home oncologist, I'd be happy to have discussions about kind of how we went about that, how, you know, how did the meetings progress, all those things. So if you're ever interested in kind of pursuing that, I'm happy to discuss kind of how the process worked for us, at least.
Yeah, I actually thank you, Megan, because I was going to say I had had a little bit of an interesting entrance into doing clinical trial, I think, from maybe your husband and from Sally, because I had started off with my surgery at a major institution and then actually was referred back to a local oncologist only because I just got really lucky. I had a local oncologist in Las Vegas at the time who was a very active in clinical trials, had been at University of Chicago and was creating, you know, a very active research environment in my community. With that being said, that's not always the case. And I just kind of want to pull on that thread a little bit with what he said, where I do think it is really important to be seeing a specialist. I think that's absolutely critical, especially if you're stage 4, right? I mean, you have to be seeing a renal cell specialist. Hopefully that's close to you, you know, or, you know, that you have the ability to see someone, whether it be through telehealth or, you know, one of the other amazing inventions that we have now. But there are some community sites that are opening. They're called in-core sites. That's how I received my clinical trial treatment, was through, it's funded by NCI. So it's, it all goes through major institutions. It's not, Joe's oncology clinic. I'm using that because it's not real, right? Not Joe's oncology clinic running the trial. But sometimes there are options closer to home for you that are still being run by, major, NCI, major institutions. I did want to address, I saw that Joel had a question in the chat for Sally, and I might steal this one a little bit, Joel, and then let Sally answer, because I have some feedback on this too. So Joel had asked, how long will you continue to be on this trial? Is there an expiration date, or just stay on? And as a trial participant, do you see the results at any time during or after the trial? So I know Sally's currently on a trial. I just want to give a perspective as someone who's no longer on a trial. So I was told when I was starting my ED results that I could stay on the trial as long as it was working for me and as long as I was receiving the medication, which is great because, like I mentioned, I was on Cabo for another almost 3.5 years, even after I had my first NED scan. The only reason why I left the trial and still kept my information involved, to Glenn's great point, was because the side effects at that point for the treatment for me were really outweighing the benefit of me staying on the medication. And we were comfortable at that point with me, getting off of Cabo and seeing how I would do. Luckily, that gamble paid off. Typically, it takes a few years for trial results to be published. In my situation, which isn't necessarily everyone's, but for mine, it was about 5 years from the time that the trial opened to whenever the results were published. So, but you don't, at least in my experience, I didn't get to see the trial results until, that happened. Other than I knew that I actually had to re-sign waivers because at one point, 2 of the arms of the trial were closed because even though they'd accrued patients to those arms, they weren't seeing the results that they wanted to see. So they closed those 2 arms. They weren't continuing to accrue patients to those 2 arms. Sally, I didn't mean to steal your thunder. If I'll turn it
That's
over to
okay.
you.
I was one of the first ones to be on the trial. That was back in April, May of 2021. And as far as an end date, I've heard rumblings about the end of the year, December of this year, but that has not been confirmed. So they said once the trial ends that I can keep going on with the same treatment because it's been doing so well for me. So I'm very happy about that. But yeah, so probably close to 4 years from beginning to end, if that is the case, if it is going to end at the end of the year. The trial I'm on, about approximately 4 years. I don't know if that's typical of other trials or just this one. Or I don't really know how that works.
So I wanted to jump in here for just a second and address some of the stuff in the chat. So Susan, I saw your comment that your husband was patient number 1 in an IL-15 trial. That is truly amazing. So, that's so admirable, and absolutely, I would agree with you that took a lot of nerve.
It was a bit of an easy choice because there was nothing but Sutent then, and he was progressing on Sutent. It would be a harder choice today.
Yes, it's a difficult treatment, to say the least.
No, compared to IL-2, it was a piece of
Now
cake.
IL-2, yes, I think IL-2 takes the cake of all the interleukins for sure. And then Glenn sent me a message to talk about kind of participating in trials, kind of the logistics. And I did think we should touch on this, to some things to kind of consider if you're thinking about clinical trials. So I would consider a few things. I would definitely consider the location. We have done trials both here in Dallas, where we were at home. We have considered trials at MD Anderson. And that was early on. And we were actually considering not only a trial, but also just continuing treatment at MD Anderson. My husband has a very rare subtype, so we have been seeing in Dallas at UT Southwestern, at MD Anderson, at Dana-Farber, at Sloan Kettering, at Brigham and Women's Harvard. So we've seen specialists kind of all over the country. In the beginning, especially, we have 2 young boys they're 10 and 12 now, but they were 7 and 5 when my husband recurred. And so, you know, it was really important to us at the time to stay close to home. And luckily UT Southwestern has one of the best kidney cancer programs in the country. So we're very lucky from that perspective. But some things to kind of consider when you're considering a trial would definitely be location. You know, trials typically cover the cost of the treatment. They cover, you know, a lot of like scans and labs and things like that are typically covered through standard of care. And then whatever is not covered, then usually the trial will cover those costs. So there's no real true out-of-pocket costs typically for the patient for the treatment. That being said, you know, travel costs typically are not covered. Now, the NIH is a different story for that because they cover costs for patients that are seen at NCI and NIH in general, but other institutions are typically not going to cover travel costs. So you kind of have to think about the location and their frequency of appointments. And also, for example, when my husband was on the first trial, he ended up, after the second infusion, having an immune-related adverse event. So he had grade 4 hepatitis, which is immune-induced hepatitis. So basically, his immune system was attacking his liver. His ALT and AST numbers were in the thousands, 3,000 and 4,000. And so luckily, we were home and they caught it very early and they reversed it. And, you know, that's why it's so important when you're on these trials to really stay diligent about the labs. Sometimes you might have labs twice a week, you know, depending on what the schedule is, but it's so important to keep up with all those things. And if you're traveling for your trial, that might be more difficult to do. And it's just incredibly important. For example, when my husband had hepatitis, he didn't really have any symptoms that weren't what you would typically think side effects of treatment were. So that's why it's so important to make sure that if you're in a clinical trial, you're staying up with all your lab checks, you're staying up with all of the consultations with your medical team, that because they're going to follow you closely. And that's not only because they want the data for the trial, but that's to keep you safe. So, you know, location is definitely a thing to consider. We did a second trial in Los Angeles. We flew to Los Angeles every week for 8 weeks. And, you know, we have a really amazing support system. My parents are here. My boys have a lot of support and they love being with their grandparents. But that being said, it does take a toll. Even for us who have a great support system, it still is very challenging to travel with that frequency for a trial. So I would say, while I wouldn't exclude it based on location, if it's something that you think would be very beneficial to your treatment, but it is definitely something to consider. And then I think a couple other just things to consider too. A lot of trials have washout periods that we should talk about. So if you're on, say, standard of care, if you're on Cabo or you're on lenvatinib and everolimus or you're on whatever treatment you're on, they are going to want you to have a washout period before they start the trial. So depending on how aggressive your disease is and what the progression of your disease has typically been, you'll want to take that into consideration. Sometimes the washout period is a matter of a couple of weeks. Sometimes it's longer. So you'll want to take that into consideration with your oncologist as to, is that a safe option for you before you decide to join a trial? I'm looking at my notes here, what else is important when it comes to like logistics. We've touched on this, and, you know, Sally and Katie and Laura, feel free to chime in anytime. I don't want to monopolize the time, but, you know, sometimes considering doing treatment trials earlier on in your treatment is beneficial because like we talked about, they're depending on the sequencing, if you've already had that class of drugs, you may be disqualified. But also the health of the patient is taken into very, very serious consideration. And if the I think there's a lot of misconception about waiting and doing a trial as a last resort. And that's probably not the best way to think about trials, because if your disease has progressed a lot, you may very well not qualify for a trial, because they look at how the patient is physically, what their blood work is, what their ECOG scores are. Like, it's, they want, their primary goal is also to keep patients safe. And so they're not going to risk essentially hurting a patient clinically if they're not strong enough or healthy enough to do the trial. So I think that's another important piece to consider. The timing of things is,
Yeah.
are you healthy enough? Are you close enough to the institution where the trial is, that if there was an adverse event, you can get there? Because, it's just incredibly important when you're doing these trials.
Yeah, Megan, I agree. I mean, look, Cabo saved my life, no question about it. It also made me incredibly ill, and I think I could have done that trial had I already done another treatment, that had worn my body down at that point. So I agree with you. I always encourage patients, especially in the beginning, not to say that you shouldn't be looking at clinical trials anytime you're changing course of treatment, but I do think that your best options are usually in the beginning, because I've sat in these meetings with doctors whenever they're talking about where we're at with the trial, right? They are devastated whenever we lose a patient on the trial, right? And you never want that to be because of an adverse effect, which is why that there are a lot of exclusions. I know they're working really hard to change some of the requirements to make it a little bit more flexible. So, even 5 years ago, there's some things that would have been an absolute no-go that now there's some technology and treatments that they can do in order to enroll those types of patients. But, if you're being excluded from a trial, it's not because we don't want you to participate in clinical research. It's really, truly for your safety and your benefit.
Yeah, one thing I want to point out as well too, just real briefly on the trials too, that I don't think gets a lot of highlights and kind of touches on one of the questions that Nicole had in the chat about. So Nicole asked, you would think the oncologist would do some of the legwork, and should we expect that most oncologists will be very knowledgeable only about their own trials? So one of the things that I wanted to highlight here is that also more and more as treatment progresses is the thought of multidisciplinary teams. And so a medical oncologist can oftentimes work with other types, like a radiation oncologist, to approach your care. And some of those trials can also be worth considering as well too. I think that a lot of times when we think of clinical trials, people kind of immediately think of systemic trials. So that's like for immunotherapy and Cabo and stuff like that. But for example, like I was in a device trial. My cancer is super rare, so it's or my subtype is super rare, so it's a little different there. But there are trials, for example, that if there is progression, maybe in just like one lesion, while you're responding to the rest of treatment, there has been trials to explore like if you can do radiation to one of those spots and things like that as well. And so I think it can be really good to look broadly at options available. And sometimes those trials might be trials that a medical oncologist might not know about because that's not in their direct realm. They might know about it, but those can be ones that can be good to explore. They don't work for everybody. So again, that kind of goes into that criteria. They look at kind of your disease progression and different things, but the multidisciplinary teams are becoming more and more important. So can add more options.
Yeah, actually,
I'd like to add that I go to a medical oncologist. I've been very happy with him. He's extremely knowledgeable about kidney cancer, and he's the one that told me about the trial. And I just want to reiterate what Meghan said about how they follow you. They follow you extremely close. I am very fortunate that my doctor is only 5 miles away down the road. And I go there once a month. The trial team comes from the main hospital in Grand Rapids to see me every month, and they have a ton of questions. They just are just so concerned. They just want to know everything. Oh, you were nauseous? When was that? What day was that? What time? Sometimes it gets, I have to admit, sometimes it gets a little repetitious at times to be being asked the same questions over and over, but they truly, truly care. And they just want to know everything about you and what you've experienced in that last month. And I feel very fortunate to be where I am, that I'm so close to treatment. And yeah, I mean, I've been happy with my doctor. I know everybody says you need an RCC specialist, but I'm very happy with my current oncologist.
And kind of jumping back a little bit to Nicole's comment, I think, our situation is a little bit different in that my husband's subtype is very rare. So I think most oncologists are probably very aware of the current clear cell trials going on. And, I'm sure Hans probably would have been happy to help me with the legwork, but I don't know. That's just kind of the way that my husband and I have approached this, just because it is such a rare subtype. Sometimes we just kind of have to go after what we feel is the best course, obviously with our medical oncologist approval, but we are typically always kind of trying to think one step ahead. If this treatment doesn't work, because there is no standard of care for chromophobe. So if this treatment doesn't work, what would be the next progression for the next treatment if there is progression? So I think that's kind of, it's not that an oncologist wasn't willing to do any legwork. It was more just that's kind of the way we have approached his disease, is to try to be as proactive as possible, just simply because it is so rare and there is no standard of care. So we're not left with a lot of choice there. And then Joel asked a couple of great
Can I ask one
questions.
thing really
Sorry.
quick?
Yep.
Sorry, no, it's okay. I just wanted to add to it. So I think just saw Hans Hammer last week, and we go to Dr. Braun at Yale right now, and both are fantastic and agreed with the standard of care. They did differ a little bit on trials. I just think it's interesting because Hans has said that my husband really at this point to just go full on immunotherapy, and so did Dr. Braun, that he's there's not going to really be any trial that would fit him right now. And typically the ones that might be better later on will be if he takes the Cabo or whatever, it doesn't progress on it. When I brought that up with Dr. Braun this week, he was like, well, we have trials up here that you don't have to progress on, a TKI, that are more immunotherapy-based trials, I think would work. So I just feel like that was one thing that they differed on, was more their trial input. And I do feel like they were more based on what they're currently working on. Not to say that either one wouldn't explore other options, and I'm obviously exploring them all, but I don't know. It was a very interesting thing to kind of be like, I know I'm the biggest advocate for my husband, and I just have to be like, I just need the best thing for him, and I don't want to wait around too long just because he might be stable right now. We think that immunotherapy might be working. It's too soon to tell, but I just don't want to miss something.
I think I think that's a great point. And I think you're doing all the right things, right? You're getting multiple opinions. You're talking it through. You're thinking about his health, aside from the cancer too, right? You're thinking about how is he doing clinically? Can he handle the immunotherapy, all these things. And I think it is hard for patients, right? Because you do sometimes get different recommendations, and like you said, their recommendations from two very well-known, very well-respected oncologists were differed a little bit. And I think it is hard because it is left at the end of the day, it's your husband and your decision, right? And that's, that can be scary. But my advice would be, you're doing all the right things, you're getting all the best, you're seeing specialists, you're seeing the top specialists, you're doing all these things. And I think you should find some, I'm trying to think of the right word, solace in that. Like, that advocating for your husband is such a huge, important job. And I really admire you for that. That you're doing all the right things. And it is hard that at the end of the day, it does come down to your decision. And that's difficult.
I'm really
Yeah.
you pointed that out too, because I think that this is actually a very, very, very important point when it comes to second opinions, and clinical trials fits right into that. So like, one, I'm glad that you highlighted it, especially the contrast in opinions there, because a lot of times they will likely know more about their trial than just about anybody else, because they had to kind of help bring the trial to life. So they're going to know more about the details and kind of what they think the promise is of it. In those scenarios, so I've ended up in lots of scenarios where there's all kinds of contrasting opinions because there's not a whole lot of information on my case. And sometimes I know for me that felt like, okay, I'm not the expert here. Can somebody just tell me like, which of these is the better route? Like, I can't make a choice here. And the way that I tended to navigate those situations for myself is evaluating both of those options, hearing what other experts might say on those options. So trying to understand those and other avenues. You can kind of find some resources sometimes online in those categories. And then also taking the other person's opinion back to the other one and asking them their thoughts in that context. Because then I would understand their approach for why they think that one might be better than the other when contrasting the two exactly against each other. And that doesn't mean that you have to take either of their opinions as kind of like, I think a lot of times, again, they're going to know most about their own specific trial that they're running. So they're probably always going to lean that way. Not in every case, but I think when I've done that in the past, hearing the way that they talk about them helps me make that final evaluation at the end for, okay, I've heard the argument of why on both sides they both had the same opinion for evaluating it against. And then that helps make that decision, because when it comes down to second opinions and evaluating clinical trials, I think, Meghan, you guys probably ran into this, I would assume, as you're evaluating all of these trials. There's so many options. It can be hard sometimes to know what the right one is. And so more opinions doesn't always lead to more clarity. And so just making sure that you feel confident in based off of the information that you have.
Yeah. I think
I
you're
can
absolutely
piggyback on
right.
that just a little bit. Sorry.
No,
because I also see that Reed has a question. That Nicole, I just want to say I'm going to give the least scientific advice I've given in quite a while. Sometimes you just have to go with your gut.
I would totally agree.
I know that may not be super helpful, and hindsight's 2020, right? But I can relate. I went through a similar situation because UCLA had told me one thing. My local oncologist had recommended a trial for me. I really debated hard, and I also was getting encouragement to go to NIH, who does great work, especially for HLRCC. So I'm not discounting that, but I also had to take into consideration. I was 29. I was trying to go back to work, mainly because I needed health insurance, right? And I had 2 kids in middle school, and they'd already been disrupted by everything that had happened, with surgery and everything else. And so for me, I felt like, do I be traveling across the country multiple times, a month in order to participate in the trial? Now, I admire Meghan and her husband for doing that, and I think that is the answer for some patients. But for me, it ultimately came down to, I have a clinical trial option that's close to me that I can do. It's not going to be incredibly disruptive to my life. And if it means that it doesn't go well for me and I don't come out of this alive, I've spent quality time with my children that they will have. And that
Yeah.
was my deciding factor. That's not everybody.
And
And, you know,
sorry.
no, it's okay. I'm just saying, and then I may have made a different decision had I had more information, but I just kind of like, you know, held my nose and jumped in,
And
right?
I would always say that if there is a clinical trial option close to home, you know, if they're tied in terms of what you think it will do treatment wise, go with one closer to home. Like, you know, it's really huge and important to be with your family. It takes a huge toll on everyone, children or no children at home. And you know, I think whether and also when you're just thinking about care, even if it's not a clinical trial, I wanted to touch on Reed's question. And Reed, if you don't mind clarifying for me. So Mayo refused to see you?
Yeah, it's sorry, it's my dad. Yeah, my dad's getting treated at Fred Hutch. So he's only been on treatment since February 29th. So he's on Cabo and I don't know the name, Nevo, I think, or what, the immunotherapy. And he also wanted to get into Mayo to get a second opinion. He was a current surgeon in previous life, retired from Mayo. So he's like, oh, I could get in there and get an opinion. And he went in there and they said they wouldn't give a second opinion to his case. And so he was a little thrown off by that. And I don't know if it's because they said, oh, I agree with the treatment you're on, but it seemed like more they said our institution doesn't do second opinions.
Say that we have always been encouraged not only by our home institution. I mean, one of the first things Hans ever said to us before he started treatment, the moment he recurred, was go to a second opinion. I'll send you, go anywhere you want. Okay. And so if your oncologist is discouraging you from a second opinion, it would maybe give me a little concern about that oncologist.
Yeah.
Secondly, the only thing that I can think of as to why Mayo might have said that is that sometimes, especially if you're newly diagnosed or newly recurred, newly metastatic, you kind of want to get those second opinions initially before you start treatment. Because sometimes I don't know, Laura and Katie, would you agree? Sometimes if you've already started treatment, they may be hesitant to put their input in on what their second opinion is if it differs, because they really want to wait and see if that treatment is working. Right. So the best time to get second opinions is probably before you start treatment or if you progress.
Yeah, or like
if you progress.
If you're in that waiting period where like you think you might be progressing soon, but you're in a like 3 months, let's see what happens next phase. I feel like that's
and it's kind of the same clinical trials. A lot of times if you're on standard of care and you are stable no your disease is reducing, if you're having any sort of shrinkage and you're on standard of care, you really can't, no clinical trial typically will not enroll you unless you have progressed on standard of care. Because if you're doing fine on standard of care, you don't want to take the risk of jumping on a trial and progressing on it. It doesn't work as well. So you want to look at clinical trials either initially or when you progress. It's typically, I don't know, Laura, would you agree?
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think
that's the time to look at these things.
Yeah, that might be why. I mean, it's hard to guess, you know, why, but that may be why they might just feel like, you know, sometimes it almost creates unnecessary noise, right. You know, if you're getting opinion right. And I mean, if they were to say, hey, we don't recommend what he's on, let's switch him to this trial. Well, to the washout period, right? It may not go well. So I think that, you know, I'm a little shocked at how that was worded to him, but I'm sure that there's probably a reason for that. And, you know, what I will say is that most of the time, if you do go get a second opinion at Mayo or MD Anderson or, you know, any of those institutions, right, but you want to have a conversation or you want to keep your local oncologists involved in the conversation, they are usually willing and happy to work back and forth with them.
Okay.
If they're not, right,
Mhm.
then you want to
It's
reconsider
a red
that. But
flag.
starting, yeah, that's a red flag. Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And
That's
I
good to
would-
know. Thank you.
Has your dad had like follow-up scans to see if the treatment is working? Yeah.
Not yet. He has one next week, and they're
Yeah,
actually doing
that's great
scans
advice.
early because he has there it's in his lymph nodes in his
Okay.
chest, and they're pretty big. So they want to do an earlier scan at 2 months. It's even less than 2 months, to be honest, and then evaluate from there.
I mean, I'm kind of shocked at the wording of that, if that was kind of how they presented it to him. But my guess would be that that's the reason behind it, is that he started treatment. They want to, they want him to be followed at his local oncologist to see if it's working before they make a differing suggestion.
Yeah.
And if we're
Right.
being
Just kinda
fair,
just
Fred
create
is
confusion.
great institutions. So,
Yeah, and we've had a good experience, and thank you. I'm just, trying to get all this information ahead of time.
Yeah.
My mom doesn't like to really know about this stuff. She's kind of on the other side of how she's dealing with it, and I'm the one trying to get
It's
all the
hard.
information.
you're doing a great job.
Well, feel free. I know Sally, Katie, and Laura, any of us would be willing to discuss any of these questions, or offline, if you think of things later on. I'm happy to put my email in the chat, and I'm happy to answer any questions if you think of things later on, after this call.
Yeah,
Thank you
Right.
so much.
same for me.
Nicole asked a question about timing for getting approved. I want to say it was just a few weeks, if even that. They said I was the poster trial for the trial. I fit all the criteria. And I think it was just maybe a week or two before I could finally start. It wasn't long at all.
Yeah, same for me. Mine was a little bit more closer to a month because I had to do an EKG and another CT scan. So they wanted to make sure that everything was my heart was healthy enough to join the trial and all of that. So it took about being approved to join the trial, initial conversation with my oncologist to actually rolling was about a month.
I think it depends where you go as well too. Because I'll say like the NCI, I'm a patient at the NCI, and it took me quite a long time to get into the NCI. We had to get another evaluation of my pathology. For my surgery with the NCI, I started pursuing them at the end of March, and I don't think I had the official word for my surgery until June. And so I think they expedite things. I know they expedite things in cases if things are more urgent. But sometimes it can be important to look out for, like, if you kind of going back to that sequencing of trials and looking at your options. Sometimes it can be good to, if you know that there's an option that you're going to pursue, to kind of inquire about what that process is like and how long it's going to take to go through the enrollment process, even maybe before you actually are going through the trial.
And I think, that is another consideration. We talked about considerations before, like where the trial location, all those things. The first trial that my husband enrolled in was opening. So the first lesion was found at the end of March in 2021. We saw Hans in April. We went to MD Anderson in July. And so he was off treatment all that time. We hadn't started treatment. And the trial that we ended up choosing was opening at UT Southwestern. It was the originating institution was Dana-Farber. So what happens sometimes is that the PI maybe at Dana-Farber, but they're opening all these trial locations, right, all over the country, especially if it's, some of these bigger name kidney cancer specific drugs, right? So the one we were on was Ipi, Nivo, Cabo, the triplet. So then you have to wait for there's obviously a lot of legalities that go on between institutions. So it literally took months while we were waiting for it to open at UT Southwestern, even though it might be going on. It was already open at Dana-Farber, or it was already open other places. So even, you know, a lot of times if it's already open at that at your home institution or your local oncologist or wherever you're being seen, it should typically be a pretty quick process. But sometimes, especially if these trials are emerging and they're newer trials, it may take a while for them to be open at the location that you're being seen at. So that's just another thing to consider. If it's already open, it should be a quick process. If it's in the process of being opened at that institution, it can take a little longer.
Yeah, I think these two pair really well with the like conversation of like second opinions or getting evaluated. Like you might not be able to, like, won't change treatment, for example, if you're seen kind of too quickly, like after starting a treatment, because you can, like, if they switch you treatment, a lot of times you can't go back to that treatment that you were taken off of, which I think is why sometimes they may not recommend a different option. And so the sequencing of these things, I think, kind of falls in line of that. I know for myself as a patient, I usually like to try to think a couple steps ahead. And so a lot of that is like information gathering so that you know what the timeline's like, so that once you do have the information, you have your scan results, you know, kind of what your decision is, if you're going to have progression or something like that, then you have those things ready to go, and you can follow up on the trials and things that you were looking to pursue from there. So they're kind of things that I think you can pursue simultaneously so that they are ready for you to execute on if you need to.
I was just wanted to say, I know we're probably wrapping up soon. It does get easier. I feel like this maybe was overwhelming for some people because, you know, all of us, Meghan, Katie, Sally, you know, we've been in clinical trials. Gary's has experience too. This isn't our first rodeo, for lack of better words, right? It gets easier. You know, we learn this knowledge hard fought. I know Meghan, I've been following you guys for a while, and Meghan is fierce with her advocacy for her husband, and you know, Katie and Sally and I have had to be as well. And it gets easier. I would probably, you know, if I have to go back on treatment, I probably would approach it very differently than I did back in 2016. Not just because thankfully the field has, you know, grown so much, but also just because I'm a different patient than I was in 2016. And so I think that, you know, learn from our missteps and our adventures, and, you know, the ways we've learned this knowledge, because you know, it can benefit you, and it does get easier as you go through this process.
Yeah, and I would just reiterate, you guys reach out to any of us at any time. You know, these advocacy organizations, whether it's Casey Cure or COA or Judy Nicholson, all, like, they are here for this very reason. They want to help, and, you know, find an advocacy group that you are comfortable with and reach out to them and make connections. And I mean, that's kind of, you know, there's power in patients banding together. And it's so important. And we, you know, I don't know anyone that wouldn't be willing to help another patient. So.
Yeah, and it's crucial for, I think, navigating this, because there's so much to learn right up front. It can be really helpful to talk to others to help distill it down to what's going to be the most beneficial at that single point. Couldn't agree more.
I was just scrolling through, making sure there wasn't anything we missed. But anyway, I know we've kind of gone over. I don't know what time we're supposed to end, but.
Well, I know, and I feel like I could talk about this forever.
I know. You should do it again.
We should, yeah. I know. Well, I know that we are getting close to wrapping up, and so I'm gonna go ahead and close this out. Thank you all so much for joining, and thank you to my fellow panelists. I know that I'm sure I learned some things today. I thought I knew everything. I didn't. I knew I didn't have everything on Clubhouse, but I thought I knew everything, and I've learned some more. So thank you so much. This will be posted on Judy Nicholson's YouTube channel next week on Monday. So feel free to go back and read through or watch it again. Also, we do have, I know all of us put our contact information in the chat. So please feel free, to Meghan's point, to reach out anytime that you have questions or concerns. And we're not doctors, but we do have a lot of knowledge among this panel. We're happy to share it. And again, if you have anything that you need to reach back out to or, you know, gather more information, please go to the Judy Nicholson Kidney Cancer Foundation's website. I know we have more clinical, more round tables that are coming up soon. My podcast will be going next week. No soft plug there. We have another episode there. And of course, Joel started has his caregiver or patient talks every month. So thank you so much for joining us. And we appreciate everyone's time. Thank you.